So I saw a video that someone was just editing in process while recording a video, sort of live editing, and I was like, you know, I could do that. I've also seen a couple where people are writing in process while recording a video, and I don't think I could do that. I can't imagine, like, being able to focus on those two things at once. But editing, I feel like I can do. So I figured, why not? I'll show you my editing process. First of all, usually when I'm editing, there is something playing in the background, preferably something, a video that I've seen about 100 times, so I'm not paying attention to it. But I need sound because I hate silence. But I'm hoping that me talking to you will cover the need for sound here. I am currently on, I think this is like draft, I've called it draft 5, but truthfully this is probably draft 6 or 7 of a project called Shadow and Light. I'm on chapter 18. This particular draft is after I've gotten a couple beta readers and I am compiling all of their like notes and working on them in one document. I have already looked at the big picture things, the things like, hey, this scene doesn't make sense. I don't like this character. I feel like this needs more description. I've already done all those fixes. And right now what I'm focusing on is the little like individual line notes. But we're starting with chapter 18. First I'm checking the physical notes that my sister gave me. And luckily she printed out 4 pages, 2-page, so that she doesn't have to, you know, waste a lot of paper. And that means it makes it really easy for me to see when she has notes on an entire chapter very quickly. And nothing on chapter 18 here. So next I check the one that I have in computer form right now. And it's in Microsoft Word, so it's really convenient that I can just scan through and look for any comments or notes. So like this couple pages down into the chapter, I'm looking for something that starts with a few more minutes down the road. Okay, while riding double on a horse? Yeah, this note is someone had, like, one of my beta readers just had problems with the notion that someone would fall asleep while riding double on a horse, which admittedly is an unusual thing to do, but it's an unusual situation. And maybe I've been misled by cowboy movies, but I have the impression that people can fall asleep while riding horses. That is something you can do. And hell, I've fallen asleep standing up before, so I will admit I'm not going to make a change there. I think that that is perfectly fine. And that's the only note he had on the entire chapter. So we're going to scroll back up to the beginning of this chapter and just start reading, because to me, that is how you should always start editing, just reading. Okay, so chapter 18. Christopher had messed up. He knew that. He could have been more subtle getting Tila out. That is a line that there's nothing objectively wrong with it. It just feels like it should keep going and it doesn't. Like the rhythm is slightly weird there. And what I do when I find a line that I'm not sure I'm happy with is I tend to just read it over and over and over again. So if this is annoying, I'm sorry. Christopher had messed up. He knew that. He could have been more subtle getting Tila out. I could change that to out of prison, but I feel like that is a waste of words. He could have been more subtle getting Tila out of prison. He could have been more subtle getting Tila out. Or I could just shorten it to he could have been more subtle, but then we sort of lose track of what's going on. It is the beginning of a new chapter, so I'm going to assume it's not too repetitive. Of prison. I have a bad problem of, because my books tend to come in at max like word count possible, when I'm editing earlier drafts, I tend to get a little bit overly happy with cutting shit, which means that I will, in later edits, have those sentences that just sort of feel like they cut off. And what it is they do cut off, because I was like, I don't 100% need the latter half of that sentence, so we're gonna cut it. But the rhythm of sentences matter. Okay, so Christopher had messed up. He knew that. He could have been more subtle getting Tila out of prison. If he had gone back to sit with his fellow guards in the common room immediately afterwards, he would have had a pretty good alibi. If he had gone back to sit with his fellow guards in the common room immediately afterwards, he would have had a pretty good alibi. Or he could have trusted the system he had devoted his life to, but he couldn't have risked letting her hang. This was not how he had imagined riding off into the sunset, or in this case sunrise, with Tila. He had broken the law, and now he was traveling with wanted criminals. Out of the corner of his eye, he glanced at Mikkel Knox. The boy looked almost as tired as Tila. The elegant, smooth, fairly exaggerated way he usually moved was faded, stilted, and economical. Is that too many adjectives? It's 3 and 3. But faintly exaggerated is double words, so it feels like more. I like the 3 and 3 because it feels like it's mirroring, but it is a buttload of adjectives in one sentence. The elegant, smooth, fairly exaggerated way he usually moved was faded, stilted, and economical. The boy looked as tired as Tila. The elegant, smooth, faintly exaggerated way he usually moved was faded, stilted, economical. I like it, it's fine. Every now and then his hand went to his neck, touching something that hung under his shirt. He didn't look like some hardened criminal who had escaped prison multiple times. He looked like a tired kid. Like the kids that had hung earlier tonight. Christopher shifted in his saddle. I say the saddle. Should that be his saddle? It's a shared saddle. Christopher shifted in the saddle. It had been a long while since he had spent an entire night on horseback. He ached. And he had sobered up. He hadn't realized he had managed to keep enough whiskey. Whiskey? Was he drinking whiskey? Now we go back to a previous chapter to find out what he was drinking. And when I have to jump back, I like to highlight in a bright color what I'm working on so I can find it easier. It's 2 chapters back that we know what Christopher was drinking. Yeah, he was drinking whiskey. Okay. I'm gonna add that back. Because also, it's been 2 chapters since we discussed that Christopher had been drinking, so it's not a bad idea to, yes, directly state that I'm talking about he was drinking alcohol. And why did I choose whiskey? Because it was the first alcohol that popped into my head. He hadn't realized he had managed to keep enough whiskey down to need sobering up. But he had been drunk. But what now? But and but. I don't like the repetition of but there. I tend to start way too many sentences with conjunctions, which there is no problem. Like, it is not actually counter to what I was taught in elementary school. It is not grammatically incorrect to start a sentence with but or and or because. But when you do it too much, like I tend to do, it starts to sound weird. But I do it anyway just because that's how I talk, and a lot of my writing style is, you know, derived from how I talk. Okay, he hadn't realized he had managed to keep enough whiskey down to need sobering up, but he had been drunk. What now? Maybe he could talk Tila into Maybe he could talk Tila into returning to Ross with him. He knew that was a stupid idea. He wasn't going to be able to just go home. He would get his parents in trouble. God, they were going to be so disappointed in him. His father... Do I need the God? I don't need the God there. Children, no fighting. Yes, part of my editing process is dealing with the kitties who decide they want to fight over who gets to be in my lap. They were going to be so disappointed in him. His father had been so proud. Is that... one of the things that I deal with a lot is I like mirroring phrases, and there is a very thin line between mirroring phrases and repetitive phrases. So, like, I'm clearly trying to set up a mirror here with they are going to be so disappointed in him versus so proud. But the question is, does that just feel repetitive? They were going to be so disappointed in him. His father had been so proud when he went off to join the guard. If I get rid of the so, though, if it's just his father had been proud when he went off to join the guard, that feels weak and just like, sorta. He'd been a bit proud. That's one thing that I disagree with a lot. A lot of people will say that adding any form of adjective or modifier into sentences makes them feel weaker, and no, that is not always the case. There is a visible feeling difference between he was proud that this had happened and he was so proud this had happened. And I don't think that's just because I read one differently. I'm keeping it for now. I might get to the end of the paragraph and come back and change it, but his father had been so proud when he went off to join the guard, even prouder when Christopher returned to tell them he had been promoted to Vanterre. His father had taken him for drinks in the tavern and told him he had always known Christopher would do great things. They had made plans that when he retired, he would come back to Ross and take over his father's business. Christopher had never really been skilled at carpentry, but he was proficient, and his father had never made fine things anyway. His mother carved beautiful figurines, but they didn't sell as well as the basic furniture his father made. He had always imagined himself marrying a woman who could take up his mother's side of the business, carving pretty things and tracking the finances. Occasionally, he had imagined Tila in that position, though he had no idea if she had any of those skills. All of that is the sort of stuff that technically could be cut. Like, it's not 100% necessary for the story to move forward, but, it's character building. You don't know who Christopher is if you don't know where he came from. So, I am inclined not to cut any of it. I'll get rid of the second so. His father had been proud when he went off to join the guard, even prouder when Christopher returned to tell them he had been promoted to Vantare. Okay, yeah, I'm accepting that and moving forward. Who was his father going to pass his business to? Who would take care of his parents once they grew too old to work? Christopher could survive. He could get a job pretty much anywhere, earn enough money, and buy himself some land. But he couldn't go back to the place the Vantare guards would know to look for him. If only he hadn't met Tila on Milliken. He sighed deeply. Do I need a Milliken Island there? I've been referring to it as Milliken the entire time. So you, watching this, who don't know the story, are probably like, what? But I'm assuming that if you've read the entire book to this point, you know what the fuck that means. If only he hadn't met Tila on Milliken. He sighed deeply. I don't need the sighing. If only he hadn't met Tila on Milliken. If he hadn't, she would have hung, and while he wasn't happy about how this ended up, he couldn't regret saving her. I'm inclined to put a but in there, but there's a but one sentence above, which is why the but has been removed there. A buttload of my editing is removing and putting back in buts. But he couldn't go back to the place the Vantare guards would know to look for him. If only he hadn't met Tila on Milliken. If he hadn't, she would have hung, and while he wasn't happy about how this ended up, he couldn't regret saving her. So, what I have right now is the if only he hadn't met Tila on Milliken is its own separate paragraph, so that the next sentence, if he hadn't, she would have hung, is on a separate line, and I'm hoping that provides enough of a contrast, enough of a separation that you get that it's a contrast, not a continuation of a thought. I am a very firm believer in using paragraph breaks for things like that. If he hadn't, she would have hung, and while he wasn't happy about how this ended up, he couldn't regret saving her. He would make this work, somehow. He had Tila, the girl he had dreamed of since he was a teenager. I have a colon in there, and I have been told, conversely, that I am using colons wrong, and that I should stop using M-dashes and put colons in all the places that I had put the M-dashes because the colons were wrong, and I am 99.9% sure I know how to use this punctuation, but because so many people have contradicted themselves about it, now I'm nervous. So now I'm inclined to switch that to a different form of punctuation. He had Tila, the girl he had dreamed of since he was a teenager. Not the second half of the sentence is not a complete sentence, so it cannot have a semicolon. I'm just gonna go with a fucking comma. He had Tila, the girl he had dreamed of since he was a teenager, and she was still the same Tila. Quiet, serious, sharp, but with a soft, pretty smile that popped up at odd moments. Getting rid of the pretty, because that's too many adjectives. And she was still the same Tila. Do I need the and there? He had Tila, the girl he had dreamed of since he was a teenager. She was still the same Tila. Quiet, serious, sharp, but with a soft smile that popped up at odd moments. Okay, that's good. She glanced back over her shoulder at him, saw him smiling at her, and snorted. I use snorting way too much, I know this, but I snort a lot, and I think that's why it ends up in my writing a lot. I could change it to snickered. It's the same effect of what I'm going for here. But I feel like snorted has a harsher sound to it, whereas snicker has a sort of more childish sound to it. Like, you snicker when someone farts in a quiet room. You snort when someone accidentally makes a dirty joke. And Therefore, I'm inclined to keep it more snorted because she's being more derisive here than being, you know, actually amused. She glanced back over her shoulder at him, saw him smiling at her, and snorted. You realize you just stole a Van Ter, and it's not clear who is speaking at that point because snorted sounds like a dialogue tag, even though it's on a separate line. I can see the confusion here. Let's keep a very simple dialogue tag here. He asked her, you realize you just stole a Van Ter? Yeah. I'm not entirely sure the her is necessary here. It could just be he asked, you realize you just stole a Van Ter? But there are two other people riding a horse right next to them, and I don't want it to be like he's having this conversation with others. I want it to be clear it is directed directly at her, so I'm keeping the her. He asked her, you realize you just stole a Van Ter? I'd say you stole yourself. He laughed. He shouldn't have. His life was in ruins, but in that moment, he didn't care. I was recently watching a video that someone made the suggestion of you always should cut the last thing that you said because chances are you kept talking after you needed to, and I don't believe that's always true, but it might be here. He laughed. He shouldn't have. His life was in ruins. I could also shorten that to he shouldn't have laughed. His life was in ruins, but in that moment he didn't care. I like that. Okay. He shouldn't have laughed. His life was in ruins, but in that moment he didn't care. I like a lot of short, choppy sentences as a staccato rhythm sometimes, and that's great, but it does reach a point that there's too much of it. And it's great for showing unease of mind, but you also want the reader to be able to read easily. Moving on, I have a paragraph break, an asterisk break. That I recently found out there is actually a word for the 3 asterisks that breaks a page. It's like an asterism or something like that. They made it to the West Coast 3 hours after... 2 hours... What? I can't read. They made it to the West Coast 2 hours after dawn. Okay. He had no idea why they planned on doing... He had no idea what they planned on doing here. There. Usually when I do asterisk paragraph breaks, it's because we're switching POV, and I don't in this case, which makes me inclined to use Christopher's name in this first line, so that we know we're still in Christopher's point of view. Okay. They made it to the West Coast 2 hours after dawn. Christopher had no idea what they planned on doing from there. Where they planned on going from there? I'm gonna go check where they planned on going. I like that better. Where they planned on going from here or there. One of the things that I often have a little bit of an emotional quandary about. I write almost exclusively in past tense. I like past tense. I don't like present tense. It feels gimmicky to me for whatever reason. And also, I cannot get out of my head when I was reading Pamela in college, the professor talking about how utterly fucking ridiculous it is. Because Pamela is an epistolary novel, which means it's written as letters, and it's written in, sometimes it's written in past tense, sometimes it's written in present tense, because she literally will be pausing the scene to write a letter. And some of these scenes involve oh, he's at the door, he's pounding on the door, I hope I survive! And I'm like, oh my god. And so, whenever I read present tense, that is what's running through my head. It ruins the effect for me. So I write in past tense. But there are moments in scenes where I write close point of view, so we are in the person's mind and they are thinking I don't know what we're doing today, I don't know what we're doing tomorrow, this happened earlier today, I don't know where we're going from here, which if it was in present tense it would be very clear that we're using today, tomorrow, here, yesterday, but because I'm using past tense it's not entirely clear because the characters are no longer there. This is past tense. So my instinct is to say Christopher had no idea where they planned on going from here, but that feels present tense. I think I'm keeping it there for now. I don't know why. This is one of those things that pops up on a semi-regular basis, and I've never been entirely sure how other authors deal with it, because I don't notice it when other authors are writing, which makes me inclined to think it's not a big deal, it's just something I obsess over, but who knows. Christopher had no idea where they planned on going from there. The only dock large enough for an ocean-ready craft was at Victoral City. There was a small fishing pier off the east coast and another on the north, but the fishermen had to get licenses for their boats, and anything with a sail had to be docked at Victoral City. The Navy had dumped gravel in any bay deep enough to act as a harbor during the last war, so that they would be too shallow for anything but dinghies and barges, and only an idiot would take those into deeper waters. I currently have it deeper water, but I'm changing that to deeper waters just because I like the sound of it. One of the things one of my beta readers talked to me about is the fact that I don't actually know that much about sailing. I am, using mostly knowledge that I can Google, or what I learned from reading True Confessions of Charlotte Doyle like 5 times as a kid. And because of that, I am currently keeping a very close eye on anything boat-related in this book, because objectively, I don't think modern-day readers care that much if I am 100% historically accurate with my ships. And also, for that matter, this isn't our history. This is an entirely different world. Why would they have the exact same styles of boats built in the exact same order in the exact same way? But I'm just keeping an eye on it. I currently have Navy capitalized there. Should Navy be capitalized? I feel like yes, because it is an institution, and it's still an institution in this world, even if it's not our Navy. Anything else in that paragraph that bothered me? No. There were some catamarans that might be able to land somewhere on Victoral, but the waters around the island were patrolled and the shores watched. I remember he specifically said something about catamarans, and I read over his notes, the beta reader, and I read over his notes and was like, yeah, that's how I use catamarans in the story, because at least from what I understand, catamarans have a very shallow draft. They can go into very shallow waters compared to everything else, because they're double hulled, which gives them a bigger base so that they're harder to tip. But objectively, like I said, I don't know nothing about sailing ships. There were some catamarans that might be able to land somewhere on Victoral, but the waters around the island were patrolled and the shores watched. I think that's clear. I think that covers all the reasons that Christopher thinks that there's no way off this island except for through Victoral City. They rode along the coast for a while, Michalnox leading the way. Then, when they were near one of the headlands, and by the way, I specifically made it a point in this book that Christopher was told to use Michalnox's full name, and part of the reason I did this was so that it's explicitly clear at all times whose point of view we're in, because if they're referring to him as Michalnox rather than Mika or Meek, then definitely we are in Christopher's point of view. Ignoring the fact that the very first use of his full name is in his own point of view. But that's besides the point. They rode along the coast for a while, Michalnox leading the way. When they were near one of the headlands, the boy stopped and dismounted. He looked around for a moment, mumbling to himself, then got back on his horse, and they continued a bit further. I always feel that sections that are just pure action end up sounding really simplistic, because you don't want to add a lot of adjectives and adverbs and stuff because it waters down what's happening. But when you don't add anything, the sentence structure gets very simplistic, and because of that, a bit repetitive. So I often reread the sections that are just pure action over and over and over again because I don't feel like they sound professional. They rode along the coast for a while, Michalnox leading the way. When they were near one of the headlands, the boy stopped and dismounted. He looked around for a moment, mumbling to himself, but then got back on his horse, and they continued a bit further. Christopher wanted to ask what he was looking for, but the boy glared every time Christopher said anything. Okay, I know the reason I used Christopher's name twice in that sentence is because I wanted to avoid pronoun confusion. Same reason I refer to Michalnox as the boy there. I don't want to have repetition, but I also don't want pronoun confusion. But I feel like something in that sentence can be changed to a pronoun. Christopher wanted to ask what he was looking for, but he glared every time Christopher said anything? That's not clear. Christopher wanted to ask what he was looking for, but the boy glared every time he said anything. That might be clear? Christopher wanted to ask what he was looking for, but the boy glared every time he said anything. I think that's clear. And Tila had fallen asleep about 30 minutes ago. He didn't want to wake her until necessary. That last sentence is not necessary. Okay. Okay. Christopher wanted to ask what he was looking for, but the boy glared every time he said anything, and Tila had fallen asleep about 30 minutes ago. A few more minutes down the road, the boy stopped again. The boy is repetitive. How about they stopped again? But then I still need to add in a Mikkel Knox. A few more minutes down the road, they stopped again. Mikkel Knox got down from his horse and again started looking around. I can probably cut one of those agains. And also, I know that it's a southern thing to list distances by time rather than by actual distance. And I'm wondering if this is one of those things that might throw you out of the narrative if you're not from the South, and therefore this is not just a normal way of phrasing it. Okay, a few more minutes down the road, they stopped again. Mikkel Knox got down from his horse, and they started looking around. This time, it seemed they were in the right place, because after a moment, he grunted and waved them over. This is it. I could technically cut the line of dialogue there. I'm going to keep it, though, because it implies something a little bit stronger. Like, without it, it implies that this is just an acceptable thing, but this is it implies that there was something specific he was looking for, and they have found it. Thomas ran the horses off, and they started down a path that Christopher hadn't even seen. There's something about this sentence that feels off to me. Thomas ran the horses off. Thomas ran off the horses. I don't like that because that confuses my brain. It sounds like Thomas is running off the top of the horses to me, and I like it takes a moment for me to reassociate what that means. Thomas ran the horses off, and they started down a path that Christopher hadn't even seen before, hadn't even seen yet, hadn't even seen from the horses. Had never seen before. No, because Christopher doesn't come out here on a regular basis. It's not like he'd know this area. And they started down a path that was invisible from the road? No. They started down a path that Christopher never would have known was there. But if I say had never would have known was there, do I need it to be, and they started down the path that Christopher never would have known was there if Mikkel Knox hadn't pointed it out? I don't think so. I think I could just have Thomas ran the horses off and they started down a path that Christopher never would have known was there. Yeah, I think that's fine. It was dangerously steep, narrow, uneven, and dropped straight down the cliffs towards a rough sea. That is too much description. It was dangerously steep. I can get rid of the uneven, I think. It was dangerously steep, narrow, and dropped straight down the cliffs towards a rough sea. I want that to be the rough sea below. At least in English, I don't know if this applies in other languages, but our minds tend to hear patterns of 3 as normal and acceptable, and anything above a pattern of 3 starts to feel heavy. So like if you're giving a list of adjectives, a list of descriptions, or even just a list, you'll notice I just did it. 3 is a number that feels really natural to English speakers, and like I said, I don't know if this applies to other languages, but it does to us. And when you add a 4th or a 5th thing, it starts to feel very heavy and draggy, and that's fine if the point that you're trying to make is that there is a lot going on. Like, if you want to make the point that this is being overly described, then yeah, use 4 or 5 adjectives. But otherwise, stick to 3. And 2 if you want it to feel like it's not a list. Christopher expected them to move slowly. It was dangerously steep, narrow, and dropped straight down the cliffs towards the rough sea below. Christopher expected them to move slowly, but the only one who showed even the slightest sign of caution or difficulty was Thomas. Do I need both caution and difficulty? No. The only one who showed even the slightest sign, even. Do I need the even? I'm a wordy bitch, so I know that part of my editing process is going, is that word necessary? But the only one who showed the slightest sign of caution was Thomas. On the steeper bits, he abandoned dignity and went down on hands and feet. Hands and feet? Hands and knees? Down on hands and knees. Yeah, it makes more sense. On the steeper bits, he abandoned dignity and went down on all fours. Instead, yes. On the steeper bits, he abandoned dignity and went down on all fours. At least that made Christopher feel better about how carefully he was moving. They were a third of the way down when Thomas's foot slipped and he tilted towards the rocky surf below. Christopher was closest, so he reached out and grabbed the boy's shoulder. Once Thomas regained his footing, he smiled shakily, mumbling his thanks, but kept moving. The other two were pretty far ahead, but Meeklenox had paused, looking back with a frown. I'm going on ahead to get the boat ready. Tila, you're babysitting. Okay, so the reason I included that in the beginning was to stress the fact that the Meeklenox and Tila move so easily, because it's one of the early clues to Christopher that they are not actually human, which he has not realized yet. And I think it works for that. It works as a hint there. But there's also the him saving Thomas thing, which it is not entirely necessary, but it feels right for the scene. So, yeah. Also, I've had a couple people mention babysitting is a rather modern phrase, which I find it funny because there are plenty of modern phrases in this book that no one has clocked whatsoever, but that one a couple of different people have clocked. And I'm sort of still inclined to keep it because I use it throughout the entire book. Like, it's not a standalone, it only happens once. There are like 4 or 5 times that they talk about babysitting, and even though I know this is a very modern concept, and I think that's the problem here. It's not that it's a modern phrase, it's a modern concept. You wouldn't have had babysitters back in the day. But I'm still keeping it, and partially because there's not another phrase that does the same thing. Like, I could say, Tila, you're being the nanny, being the governess. Those have very different vibes than babysitting. So I'm keeping it as is, even though I know a couple people have clocked it as feeling anachronistic. Now, on the other hand, if I ever have an agent who wants to publish this for me and they clock it as anachronistic, sure, I'll find another phrase. It's fine. I'm going on ahead to get the boat ready. Tila, you're babysitting. Tila nodded and climbed back up to join them. You two all right? I vaguely have the inclination of putting a comma in there, and I don't think there's a comma in there. Thomas just nodded, but Christopher asked, "What about you? Aren't you tired?" "I'm babysitting you, not the other way around. Come on, we still have a way to go." Okay, yeah. Thomas very rarely speaks, and I think that's fine. It's good. Thomas is not a talkative character, but I do find it slightly harder to build a character for him because he is so silent. He opened his mouth to ask where they were going, but then his foot slipped and Thomas had to hold him steady. I also kept the Christopher saving Thomas so that Thomas could save Christopher, and it could be a nice balance thing. It shows them developing friendship without having to use words. He opened his mouth to ask where they were going, but then his foot slipped and Thomas had to hold him steady. "Don't fall, I can't catch you," Tila joked. Then he caught sight of her face and realized she wasn't joking. I was just watching someone edit the other night, and they kept editing out anything where a character knew the other character's, like, mood. And I will point out there are times, yeah, you can read someone's face and tell what they're thinking. And I personally like the way I did that one. And hell, she was right. Do I need the hell there? I've had a couple of other people clock that hell has certain Christian connotations, that not every religion has a hell, so including hell feels anachronistic. And I will point out that the Victorial society that Christopher is from has a very, like, Western Christian feel to it, even though they are not Christian. We never discuss their religion whatsoever in this book. Like, word of God here is, yeah, they are a religion that is at least analogous to Christianity. So yeah, I'm perfectly fine with them saying hell. But because of that, I'm inclined to remove any hells that are not 110% necessary in case like it doesn't look good. Okay, where was it? Don't fall, I can't catch you, Tila joked. Then he caught sight of her face and realized she wasn't joking. And hell, she was right. She probably weighed half of what either of them did. I think that's clear. It's clear that the reason she can't catch them is because she's so small. The path only got hairier the closer they got to the bottom. By the end, they were climbing more than walking, though when he glanced down to check on her, Tila seemed to find the path as easy as the high road in Victoral City. He knew that Tila had better balance than he did, but he felt like he was just learning to walk watching her. In comparison to her? He knew that Tila had better balance than he did, but when he compared himself to her, no. But when he watched her, I think that makes more sense. When he watched her, he felt like he was just learning to walk. There's something that's not necessary. He knew that Tila had better balance than he did, but when he watched her, he felt like he was just learning to walk. I can say that smoother. He felt like a deer learning to walk, no. But when he watched her, he felt like he knew that Tila had better balance than he did, but when he watched her, he felt like he was barely struggling to walk, no. Is it even necessary? I find that often when I'm struggling to make a sentence sound perfect, it's because it doesn't belong in the damn manuscript. Okay, by the end they were climbing more than walking, though when he glanced down at her, Tila seemed to find the path as easy as the high road in Victoral Sea. He glanced back at Thomas to reassure himself that he hadn't suddenly gone immensely clumsy. Maybe no, it is necessary. He knew that Tila had better balance than he did. Than him? No, I'm pretty sure asking that he did. Had better balance. Tila had better balance than him. No, actually, maybe him. Okay, because we're comparing Tila to him, not the actions. But when he watched, he knew that Tila had better balance than him, but when he watched her, he felt like he was just learning to walk. But watching her, yeah, that is somehow it changes something. But watching her, he felt like he was just learning to walk. If I read this sentence over and over again, I can tell you when there's something that doesn't jive, there's a different part of speech, it's just wrong. Can't always figure out what it is, but I figure out there's something wrong. He knew that Tila had better balance than him, but watching her, he felt like he was just learning to walk. Yeah, okay. He felt like he looked like he was just learning to walk. He felt like he looked like he knew he looked like he was just learning to walk. Oh my god, why can't I make this sentence work? He knew that Tila had better balance than him, but watching her, he felt as clumsy as an ox. I could just change it to a simple analogy. I could change the sentence entirely. He felt like a clumsy ox. I like something that dawdling baby deer feeling. He felt like a baby deer taking his first steps. I want the cuteness here, not the like big clunky feeling. He felt like How long do I work on this sentence? He was 200 miles in him, but watching her, he felt like a baby deer taking its first steps. But watching her, he felt like a baby deer taking its first steps. That makes more sense. He glanced back at Thomas to reassure himself that he hadn't suddenly gotten immensely clumsy. The boy snorted. I can't just say that it wasn't just him. He glanced back at Thomas to reassure himself it wasn't just him. The boy snorted. Don't compare yourself to the Costi. Thomas is the only one of the characters that I have some qualms with calling the boy, because I know that Christopher thinks Thomas looks older than him, and Thomas is older than Christopher. And in my experience, people do still tend, at least our generation, do tend to still refer to themselves as boys and girls when they're in their early 20s. But people who are older than you are rarely boys once you're above 18. And also, Thomas is just a bigger guy. And yeah, I can use the word guy, but there is something that feels modern about the word guy. And there's something that feels bro-ish about the word guy, so I tend to avoid it. If I change it to just... And also, it's a snorted. How about I just get rid of that? And just say, don't compare yourself to the Costi, Thomas said. One of the things that it took me a very long time to learn is that, yes, you don't want the repetition of too many dialogue tags that are just, this person said, that person said, he said, she said, he said, she said, he said, she said. But the occasional one sort of vanishes from a person's mind. You don't really read them much. It's okay to have them. Don't compare yourself to the Costi, Thomas said. What? He shook his head and continued sliding down the path. At the bottom, Christopher found himself on relatively flat rocks that were covered in algae and seaweed. Turns out the cliffs had been hollowed out over the centuries by the waves, and there were alcoves and caves as far as he could see in either direction. Their little path was one of the few spots where there was a way to climb down without having to drop the last 10 feet into the water. I think it's clear what I'm talking about here. I can picture it perfectly in my mind. I know what I'm talking about. I've never been entirely sure if anyone else does. The tide was lapping at the rocks they stood on, and a few feet away, Mikkelnox was standing in water up to his thighs, keeping hold of a boat. It didn't take a genius to realize the dinghy had been tucked into one of the little caves. Christopher could actually see 3 more tucked just beyond the high tide line. I think that's fine. While Thomas climbed towards the craft, Christopher quietly asked Tila, While Thomas climbed towards the craft, I don't need that. How about I just cut that? Thomas quietly asked Tila, where are we taking that thing? It was far smaller than the boat they had sailed to Bashing. Sailed into Bashing? They had taken to Bashing? I mean, you do sail a boat. That makes sense. It just feels like that sentence, rhythm-wise, is missing. It was far smaller than the boat they had sailed to Bashing. The problem is it's not iambic pentameter, and that's the problem. It was far smaller than the boat they had sailed to Bashing. No, actually, it is. It's fine. He really hoped they didn't plan on sailing it into open water. Given a choice between getting arrested and drowning, Christopher would take the guard. Just out the shipping lane, we'll be picked up. Mikkelnox cleared his throat, cutting her off. When she turned to look at him, he snapped, Van Ter. He's coming with us. He's going to see. Then he'll find out when we get there. What does he think I'm going to do with the information? Don't know, don't care. Not giving you the opportunity. Do you always answer for everyone? Christopher snapped. The boy snorted, but otherwise ignored the question. I'm inclined to change that to laugh, just because I know I overuse snorting, but the problem is that feels like it should be harsh. It shouldn't. Laughed feels soft. Laughed feels friendly. This is not a friendly interaction. And snickered is too, once again, childish. Chortled is by far too kind. I could say the boy rolled his eyes, but he's too far away to really see it. I could just say the boy ignored the question. And by the way, I definitely do want Mikkelnox and Tila referred to as girl and boy, because part of the point of their characters is the Kasi are very small people, so they're often underestimated and assumed to be younger than they are. The boy ignored the question. No, I'm keeping it. The boy snorted, but otherwise ignored the question. See, this is the problem. Things that are repetitive, I can always argue with myself as to why they need to be there. Christopher helped them haul the boat into clear water and held it while the smaller 2 climbed in. Thomas held it for him. There's a comma there that doesn't need to be. Christopher helped them haul the boat into clear water and held it while the smaller 2 climbed in. Thomas held it for him. Then the 2 of them took up the oars while Mikkelnox gave directions. He wasn't exactly sure what the boy was using to navigate. Is that a pronoun confusion? Because Mikkelnox is the last noun we get. But we're in Christopher's point of view, so there is a somewhat just presumed assumption that he is going to refer to the POV character. I think I'm safe here. He wasn't exactly sure what the boy was using to navigate. He didn't have a compass, a sextant, or charts. But see, here, this is a problem, because that he refers to Mikkelnox. But I don't want to say Christopher again that soon. I can change that he to a they, though. Okay. Okay. He wasn't exactly sure what the boy was using to navigate. They didn't have a compass, sextant, or charts. Christopher couldn't see any landmarks beyond the coast itself, but Mikkelnox rarely looked back at it. After about an hour, he told them to stop. An hour's rowing. Is that too much? But they're rowing against a current. I'm going to briefly Google how far you can row out in an hour. How far can you row out from shore in an hour? I don't know how any writer ever wrote anything before Google. Okay, Quora. How long does it take to row 10 miles? Not quite what I'm asking. We'll just go with this one. How far can you row in an hour? No, that's how far can you walk in an hour, which is not what I asked. How far can the average person row in an hour? A good distance for 60 minutes is... That's like exercise rowing. I'm talking about casual, gentle rowing, trying to just get somewhere. I'll be vague. After a while, he told them to stop. They sat there for probably an hour, only taking that's why I changed it to an hour, because I realized that I had said that they were being picked up at noon, and like it was dawn when they were riding out of the city, and I realized that I had just miscalculated the time entirely, so I just was throwing hours in a desperate attempt to fill in the time. But if I'm vague enough, we can assume a time skip. After a while, he told them to stop. They sat there for probably an hour, only taking up the oars to maneuver back when they drifted. That makes sense. Though, truthfully, I suspect that if you're sitting out in the ocean, you do have to row pretty much continuously to stay vaguely in the same spot. But they can move about a bit. It's fine. It's fine. Christopher glanced over at Tila. Do I need the directional? No. Christopher glanced at Tila, wanting to ask her what the hell they were doing, but she was asleep again, curled up on the back seat of the dinghy. He turned to ask Meeklenox instead, and the boy glared him to silence, without either of them saying a word. He wasn't an idiot. He knew why Meeklenox didn't like him. No thief would happily befriend a Vantair guard, but he had saved Tila. That should earn him some credit. Christopher was beginning to drift off to sleep when Meeklenox muttered, "That it?" "Don't know, too far away," Thomas replied. And that should be a comma. Christopher sat up and twisted around to see what they were talking about. There was a ship, or at least he assumed it was a ship. From this distance, it was barely more than a dot. Christopher let himself slouch back down over the oar, half asleep. It had been a long night, and he had a headache. He was drifting half in and half out of sleep when he realized he was hearing voices. Thomas and Meeklenox were talking, their voices a murmur barely rising above the rush of the waves. And I think it's okay for him to clearly hear one conversation and then only vaguely hear another because he's half asleep and they get quieter. It's fine. Can get at least another couple gold for the pen. One of the things that I've always noticed is when you're actually talking to people, when you're actually listening to people, especially listening in on conversations, you don't hear entire conversations. You hear snippets of different phrases that you can put together. But when you try to write that, it always looks weird. And I always try to do the ellipses leading into a sentence, but you need to give the reader enough to know what the fuck is going on, and I always worry that it just looks weird. Can get at least another couple gold for the pen. That gives you enough information to know what we're talking about. If the captain doesn't take it, Meeklenox grunted, we are 1 gold shy. Does the Vantair have gold? Mika, Thomas's voice reprimanded. I could shorten that to just Thomas reprimanded, but I want the implication here being that Christopher has his eyes closed, he's not paying attention, he's just paying attention to the voices. Mika, Thomas's voice reprimanded. What? He should pay his way. He's got 3 gold. And I feel like there should be a pause there. What? He should pay his way. Sometimes I'll add dialogue tags just to imply a pause in the middle of a sentence, and also to imply a contrast, a change. But a dialogue tag here would feel repetitive. What? He should pay his way. He's got 3 gold. I think I'm leaving it? Okay. How did the boy know he had 3 gold on him? He forced his... Christopher. How did the boy know he had 3 gold on him? When was the last time I used Christopher? Christopher. There's too many Christophers here. Oh god, there's way too many Christophers here. Going back up. Christopher was beginning to drift off to sleep when Meeklenox muttered. That can be a he. Was beginning to drift off to sleep when Meeklenox muttered, that it? Don't know. Too far away, Thomas replied. Christopher sat up and twisted around. That one needs to be Christopher because we need to clarify who we're talking about. There was a ship, or at least he assumed it was a ship. From this distance, it was barely more than a dot. He let himself slouch back down over the oar, half asleep. Okay, then we go back down here. Okay, then that Christopher makes sense. How did the boy know he had 3 gold on him? Christopher forced his eyes open and reached for his belt pouch. He still had the silver and pennies, but the gold was gone. Missing? No, it's not missing. He knows exactly what the fuck it is. Mikolnak snorted and held up the 3 coins, smiling as though he had just done a magic trick. Don't sleep around thieves unless you want to make a donation. Christopher, I have no idea when that cut off, so you might be missing some. 3 gold, where the we go? 3 gold, where the hell are we going? Good question, Thomas, where are we going? Casmar. Both Christopher and Mikolnak grunted, though presumably for different reasons. Passage from Victorial City to Casmar is 1 gold on the nicest ship, Christopher commented. Commented feels too soft for me. I'm going to change it to challenged. That's not how you spell challenged. Both Christopher and Mikolnak grunted, though presumably for different reasons. Passage from Victorial City to Casmar is 1 gold on the nicest ship, Christopher challenged. Well, we're not in Victorial City, now are we? Mikolnak held out his arms, showing off the open ocean around them. He pushed himself... That would be... No, Christopher. Christopher pushed himself upright, looking again at the dot that was probably a ship. Do I like probably? Do I want it to be presumably? No, I've used presumably recently. Christopher pushed himself upright, looking again at the dot that was probably a ship. It was clear, it was closer now, near enough to count the masts. It was closer now, near enough to count the masts. 2. A large ship, but not one of the giant ones that sailed across the open ocean to the Greater Southlands. I think that's fine. I looked it up, yeah, I could define exactly what kind of ship it is, but my readers aren't going to know that unless you are somebody who does sailing, and this book is not about sailing. So if I use the actual specific name for what the boat is, you're still not going to know. Whereas readers can assume a 2-mast ship is smaller than a 3-mast ship. Easy. How do you know that's our ship and not a patrol? This one I have been bothered with since I wrote. Because I want to be clear what I'm talking about with a patrol. Because, I have referenced the Navy patrols this area, but would you immediately think a Navy patrol if I say just a patrol? Mikolnak rolled his eyes. We don't. Do I need the Mikolnak rolled his eyes? Is it clear that Mikolnak is the one speaking here? Yes, because Mikolnak was the one who spoke last before Christopher. So, 2. A large ship, but not one of the giant ones that sailed across the open ocean towards the Greater Southlands. To the Greater Southlands. How do you know it's our ship and not a Navy patrol? We don't. Welcome to the life on the other side of the law. Welcome to life on the other side of the law. That's good. Christopher pushed himself up to his knees, trying to get a better look. He had never really paid much attention to the Navy patrol ships. He knew they were dark-hulled and dark-sailed, but beyond that he had no idea. The other 2 went back to chatting, so quietly it took Christopher a moment to realize he couldn't understand them. He listened closely, but he didn't even recognize the language. Is it clear they're speaking a different language? I feel like it's clear. Yeah. The indecipherable murmurs, combined with the gentle swaying of the boat and his sheer exhaustion, quickly settled him back into a half-asleep state. How about just a half-stupor? Yeah. The next he knew, Tila was leaning over him, commanding, "Take off your cloak, Christopher. We don't want anyone panicking." He blinked blearily at her. By the light, it was nearing noon, and the ship was much closer, close enough to see figures on the deck. It looked like any of the hundreds or It looked like any of the 100 or so... Why do I always do that? Why do I feel the need to be vague? It looked like any of the hundreds of merchant ships that came and went from Victorial every day. Your cloak, Christopher, quickly, before they see it. Why would anyone be scared by my cloak? Scared of my cloak. People can be scared by things, but it's far more common for people to be scared of things. Are all Vantairs this dumb? Mikolnak snapped. He was standing in the fore of the boat, waving a small black flag above his head. He's waving a small punk band. See, this is my problem. My brain does associations, and it's a problem. Christopher frowned, but now that he was slightly more awake, he was putting 2 and 2 together. A black flag being picked up offshore, the overly expensive fare. They were being picked up by smugglers, and smugglers wouldn't pick up a Vanterre. He undid the clasp quickly. Originally, he had a little bit longer before he figured out what the fuck was going on, and then I realized I don't want this character to be a goddamn moron, so I fixed it. He undid the clasp quickly, letting the fabric fall to pool around him. He wadded up into a ball, but then wasn't sure what to do with it. For just a second, he wondered if he should throw it away, but he had worked too hard for it. There's a lot of "it's" there. Does that bother me? It is one of those innocuous words that is very common in the English language, so it's less noticeable when it's repetitive, but especially considering it's at the end of several phrases. He wadded up into a ball, but then wasn't sure what to do with it. I could just say what to do. No. I need the "with it." What to do just doesn't feel right. For just a second, he wondered if he should throw it away, but he had worked too hard for it. They all feel necessary. He could feel the wind cutting through him without it. I wanted that to imply that he feels naked and unshielded. He could feel the wind cutting through him. I think I don't need the "without it." Yeah. He could feel the wind cutting through him. He had a shirt and jerkin. He had on a shirt and jerkin, but he had not left home without his cloak in over a year. "Who's there?" "Waiting on the burl," Meikle shouted back, his voice carrying easily across the gentle waves. "You're not who I talked to." "Thomas," Meikle muttered. I'm wondering if all of these need exclamation points because they're shouting. Here would be a great place to use an interrobang, but I don't know how to actually write one on my computer. And also, interrobangs are not necessarily accepted as, like, just norms of writing in standard American English. So, I might turn off an agent who's less, friendly to creative writing. You're not who I talked to, Thomas, Meikle muttered. And this is why I sort of want to use exclamation points, because I want to differentiate the fact that this line is quiet versus all the others that are loud. Yeah, I'm going to use at least 1 or 2 exclamation points here. Waiting on the burl. You're not who I talked to. See, that just sounds overly exciting. You're not who I talked to, Thomas, Meikle muttered. The larger boy pushed himself up on his knees. Thomas and Christopher took up the oars, maneuvering the small boat alongside the ship. By the time they were close enough to reach out and touch the hull, the ship had lowered 2 lines. Tila and Meikle hooked the lines to the fore and aft of the boat. Meikle shouted "ready," and the boat was hauled up. I can change that to "they were hauled up." That is to get rid of the repetition of the boat. The ship had already caught the wind again, pulling away from the spot they had picked up their illegal passengers as quickly as possible. I originally thought that this maneuver might not actually be something that could happen. Like, I imagined it in my mind making sense, but then I was like, are the seas too rough around a boat? But I looked it up, and this is something that boats did. Like, actual ships did occasionally pick up dinghies this way. The captain demanded their gold before the boat was even swung over the deck, and Christopher was appalled by how quickly Meikle handed the money over. These smugglers could have dropped them back into the sea without a second thought. But they didn't. They pulled the boat into position with the other dinghies, a couple of sailors even holding out a hand to help their passengers on board. Is "on board" supposed to be 2 words, or is it supposed to have a dash? I feel like it's supposed to be a dash. Let's see. On board... That's a computer program. That's not what I'm looking for. It seems it's 1 word. Okay, cool. Fixing on board. Passengers on board. The sailor offering a hand to Tila held on long after the sailor offering a hand to Tila held on long after the point it was necessary, even after she tried to pull her hand away. "Welcome to the burl, little miss." Christopher stepped forward, but before he could say anything, Meikle offered the man his hand. "Hi there." Hey there, actually. Hey there. "My name's Mika. What's yours?" The smile on his face was crooked, but aggressively friendly. The sailor first looked confused before a happy smile played across his face. "I'm Taylor. Welcome aboard." Mikonox laughed, a bright sound that drew the attention. That drew attention. What? That drew the attention of everyone on deck. That is correct. A bright sound that drew attention of everyone on deck. Though to Christopher's ear, it sounded as fake as his smile. So, I know what's supposed to be happening in that scene. In my mind, it's very clear. I'm not entirely sure it's clear to everyone else. But I'm not good at writing flirting. And that was supposed to be a moment of weird, like, basically Mikonox is interceding to, like, prevent this guy from trying to hit on Tila by just putting himself in that position instead. And I think it's clear. I'm still not entirely sure it's at all clear to anyone else. None of my beta readers have commented on it at all, so I don't know. Mikonox laughed, a bright sound that drew the attention of everyone on deck, though to Christopher's ear it sounded as fake as his smile. That's enough of that, the captain snapped. Maddox, show our guests to their bunks. Actually, show our guests their bunks. And you kids, I expect you to stay off my deck. Clear out. The sailor led them below, straight past... that should be the wrong past. Hi, I consistently mess up past and past. Every time. Straight past the cabins and to what looked like an empty expanse of wall. He pressed on one board, and a section of wall popped out, showing a narrow, hidden cabin. It looked claustrophobically small, but the others stepped in, Tila and Mikonox already climbing into the bunks because there wasn't floor space for all of them. The sailors gave them an apologetic smile. Don't worry, Captain Sanders isn't that much of a hard-ass. Is hard-ass one word or two? I feel like hard-ass is a dash. Hard-ass versus hard-ass. One of the fun things about using, like, curse words is they are less standardized because they are not part of academic English. This Collins dictionary says I should put a dash in it. Dictionary.com says I should put a dash in it, and Merriam-Webster says dash. So we're doing dash. Captain Sanders isn't that much of a hard ass. You can come out once we're out to sea. You can come out once we're out to sea. Do I need both? Oh dear. You can come out once we're to sea? No. At sea? I think I might need both those outs, which is a problem. You can come out once we're away from shore? Oh no. Oh no. This is a bad one. You can come out once we're safely at sea? Once we're at sea? You can come out once we're safely at sea. That works. He handed Christopher a lamp and waved him inside, shutting the door firmly behind him. And that's the end of the chapter. Now, taking that girl's advice, do I need to cut that last paragraph? No, because it's just pure action. Okay, so that's how I edit one chapter. I think this has taken like 50 minutes because I've had to hit play on my camera like 5 times, and my camera can record about 10 minutes at a time. So, yeah. This chapter went smoother than the previous chapter I edited. I really thought that previous chapter was good to go. And then I hit a spot in the middle that was like, none of this really is logical. There is a plot hole here. So I had to just rewrite a large section of that chapter, which always makes me nervous because when I'm rewriting it, this is new text, which means it really needs to be edited again to make sure it makes sense. But yeah, that's my editing process. I hope you randomly enjoyed. And here comes Michaela to put her butt in the shot. Child. Thanks for watching.